All right, good evening, brothers and sisters in Christ. Welcome to the Law of Christ Ministries. For today, we will continue our study on eschatology principles. This this section today was not part of the original plan that I had. However, I felt enticed to exegete what we know as the Olivet discourse because I think it's very important. I didn't want to just kind of zoom by it. So I figured I'd just take a 1 week to uh, make a video and we exegete this passage. Now, right off the top, I will admit this is a controversial passage, and there are certain parts where they are a little bit difficult. Anytime there's prophetic language, apocalyptic language, stuff is said, and you're just like, what? What in the world is that? You know what I'm saying? So be mindful of that. Like I've always said, when it comes to eschatology, nobody has it 100%. But I'm pretty confident that my exegesis on the Olivet discourse is going to be accurate. There are a few parts, especially towards the end in the Matthew account, where I'm going to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. I am open to being corrected, but I think if we follow the flow of what happened before and just continue it, I think it makes sense. But like I said, however, these things are very difficult, and I'm not gonna sit here and lie like I have it all down because when it comes, like I said, to eschatology, man, it's very, very difficult to understand. So I actually took a different approach where I was gonna exegete the Olivet Discourse, but I was gonna use the three Gospels account. When I when I read the three Gospels, you guys see it right here. I have Mark, Luke, and Matthew here, their account of the Olivet Discourse. And remember, they're complementary, they're not contradictory. As I'm reading them, all three, and I separated by certain sections, it in some parts it makes it more clear on what's going on. So I will ask that you guys be patient. I'm gonna try to not to speak too fast. There's a lot. I have about 9 pages full of notes, a lot of scripture. I'm not gonna read every single thing, but I be patient, and I ask that you guys really take the time to study this. Don't just skim through it. I would actually encourage you, maybe even stop as you're watching this video and read Mark 12, Luke 20, and Matthew 23, which is the chapter before the Olivet Discourse in the Gospels, so you can get a context of what's going to happen. I was going to actually read all of it, but I don't want to be here for 2 hours. So the Olivet Discourse in Mark is chapter 13, 1 to 37, and Luke is 21, 5 to 36, and Matthew is 24, 1 to 51. So, like I mentioned, before we begin, we must understand the context and the audience in the Gospels that speaks of the Olivet Discourse. Who was Jesus talking to, and when did he say that all these things were going to happen? The Gospel of Matthew, keep in mind, it was written more towards a Jewish audience. Okay, so that was actually the longer version, and it has some extra stuff, and it's actually the most difficult one, to be honest with you. Mark was written more towards a Gentile audience, and then Luke, remember, he was writing it to someone named Theophilus, which could have been a Roman official, or that who that is debated, but it leans more to it was an individual with Gentile descent. I don't think it was actual Jewish person or Jewish audience. So we have one Jewish audience and two Gentile predominant audience of the Olivet Discourse. So where you're going to see that the Gospels do not say the same thing. They are complementing themselves. So we're going to use the three gospels to try to understand what is going on. So the background to the Olivet discourse in Mark 12, Luke 20, and Matthew 21, 23, this is what's going on. So in the Matthew 23 account, we see that Jesus begins talking with the crowd about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. They're telling them, do as they tell you, but don't do as they do, because the Pharisees were really good at telling people what to do, but they themselves wouldn't do it. And it reminded me of this passage in Romans 2:21 and 23 says, "You, therefore, who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that one shall not steal, do you steal? You who say that one should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, through your transgression of the law, do you dishonor God?" The Pharisees were known to do their works, but to boast in themselves and to be noticed by people. They wanted to be praised by man, like if they were some super holy people. But God doesn't want that. God wants us to be more like servants, right? And he wants us to humble ourselves. While the Pharisees, they were more prideful individuals who exalted themselves. And we see, as you read Matthew 23, that Jesus pronounces a series of woes to the Pharisees, which are judgment, condemnation for their actions. And then we see from Matthew 23, starting with verses 34 to 36, that Jesus begins speaking of the judgment that will fall on Jerusalem in their generation. Because remember, Jesus is talking to the scribes and the Pharisees, and he's telling them that there's going to be judgment that's going to fall on Jerusalem in their generation. So the audience and context is Jesus speaking to the Jews of the first century, okay? And then we see that in verse 37, Jesus, that the famous passage where Jesus is lamenting over Jerusalem for they rejected him. And in verse 38, Jesus gives a judgment of condemnation on Jerusalem, where it says, "Behold, your house is being left to you desolate." Right? And it reminded me of this passage, not the first time that the house of being desolate has been said to the Jews. In 1 Kings 9:7-8, it says, "Then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and the house which I have set apart as for my holy name. I will cast out of my presence. So Israel will become a proverb and byword among all peoples, and this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone who passes by will feel desolate and hiss and say, why has Yahweh done this to this land and to this house?" In Luke 20, what happened there was the Jewish leaders were questioning Jesus about different topics, about paying taxes, about the resurrection, just different stuff. They're just trying to challenge him. They didn't like his response. And then in Luke 20, verses 46 to 21:4, Jesus also calls them out for their hypocrisy and their failures. In Mark 12, Jesus is teaching, he's teaching parables, which offend the Jewish leaders. The Jewish leaders are questioning him and testing him about certain topics. And Jesus is calling out the Jewish leaders' hypocrisy and failures also. Okay, so that's the background of what's going on before we actually get into what is known as the Olivet discourse. Okay, now that you have the background in mind, remember that as we're going through this. All right, so the first section is Jesus predicts that the temple will be destroyed. And coming out from the temple, Jesus was going along, and his disciples came up to the point came up to point out the temple building to him, and he answered and said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. So who is Jesus talking to? He is talking to his disciples. And Luke says, and while some were talking about the temple, that it had been adorned with beautiful stones and dedicated gifts, he said, as for these things which you are looking at, the days will come in which there is not be left one stone upon another, which will be torn down. And in Mark, he was going out from the temple. One of his disciples said to him, teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and wonderful buildings. And Jesus said, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. Okay, so that's the beginning of this whole Olivet discourse here. The disciples are asking him, they're pointing out the beauty of the temple, and Jesus in all three accounts says it's going to be torn down. Okay, then we move on to the second section. This part is when the disciples asked Jesus regarding about his comments about the temple being brought down, right? So they're going to ask him, like the disciples asked Jesus, and so when is these things going to happen? You know, when is the sign of your coming and the end of the age? We see that in Matthew's account. And Matthew's account is kind of strange because it seems like they're asking three different questions, whereas Luke and Mark just has them at two questions. Matthew says, when will it happen? What will be the sign of your coming? And what is the sign of the end of the age? Whereas Luke says, when will it happen? And the signs of when the temple will be destroyed. So let's read it. Now, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the age of your coming and of the end of the age? Okay. In Luke, it says, so they questioned him, saying, teacher, when therefore will these things happen? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? Again, talking about what Jesus has just said, that the temple will be destroyed. In Mark, it says, as he was sitting on Mount Olives opposite to the temple, Peter, James, and John, Andrew, questioning him privately, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? So we see that in Mark and Luke, the questions that they're asking, it's easier to understand that they're talking about what he just said. Like I said, when is all this is going to happen? What are the signs that the temple is going to be destroyed? What makes Matthew a little bit more difficult is that end part where it says, in the age, and the end of the age. But we'll continue. We'll get into that. Okay. So then we move on to the next section. So here's where here comes the meat of it here. So in this section, we're going to see that Jesus responds to what the disciples had asked him. He told them, he predicted the temple was going to fall. The disciples asked, okay, well, when is this going to happen? What are the signs? What should we look for? In this section right here, Jesus is responding. In the Matthew account, it says, and Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you are going to hear of wars, rumors of war. See that you are not alarmed, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, in various places. There will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. So let's stay in the context. What he just said right now, he is saying to his disciples in the first century. So let's stay in context. Jesus was calling out the Jews in the temple. He tells them of a punishment, a condemnation, a judgment that was coming upon them. They leave. The disciples are asking about the temple, how beautiful it is. Jesus predicts it's going to fall. The disciples ask them, hey, well, when is this going to happen? And then Jesus begins his response, and, well, these are the things that, you should look out for when it's going to start happening. In Luke's account, it says, see to it that you are not deceived. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end does not follow immediately. Then he continued, saying, the nations will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes in various places, famines and plagues, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and will persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. It will result in an opportunity for your testimony. So set in your hearts not to prepare beforehand to defend yourself, for I will give you the mouth and wisdom which none of your opponents will be able to resist you. So again, pay attention. He's saying you a lot because he's talking to his disciples. In the Mark account, and Jesus began saying, see to it that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and will mislead many. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. These things are merely the beginning of the birth pains. But see to yourselves, for they will deliver you to the courts. You will be beaten in a synagogue, and you will stand before the governors, kings, for my sake, as a witness to them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all the nations. And when they lead you away, delivering you up, to not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speaks, but it is the Holy Spirit. Okay, in Matthew's account, we see that disciples need to watch out that no one deceives them. Many people are going to come claiming to be the Messiah. They're going to be hearing wars and rumors of wars. Nations and kingdoms will rise up against each other. There's going to be famines and earthquakes. And the disciples, right, in context, the disciples will be delivered up in times of tribulation. They will be killed and hated on for their faith in Christ. And we all know that the disciples, they suffered and were killed for their faith. In Luke's account, the same thing. The disciples are not to be deceived. There's going to be many false messiahs that are going to appear before that time. Same thing about the rumors of wars, nations, and kingdoms. In this account, there's earthquakes, there's famines, there's plagues, there's terrors and signs from heaven. Just got to be careful that we don't take everything too literal, because we are dealing with apocalyptic language. Remember that. Disciples will be persecuted, thrown into prison. They will stand before kings and governors. This will be an opportunity for them to give a great testimony about Christ, and Christ will be the one helping them. In Mark's account, again, the disciples are told to be aware of the deception of false messiahs, about the rumors of the wars and earthquakes and famines. The disciples will be delivered to councils and will be beaten in the synagogues. They will stand before governors and kings and will be a witness. But in this account, it is the Holy Spirit that will be guiding the disciples. And that the gospel must first be preached to all nations. In the context, if we're talking about the first century, to all nations, is talking about the known world of the time, which would be mostly, I would say, the Roman world. Okay, so as we're moving along, let's use the Gospels to complement. Let's get information from each one to put the pieces of the puzzle to get a fuller understanding. So up to this point, I think it's very clear what's going on, who the audience is. So let's keep moving forward. The next section, Jesus is talking about just more signs the disciples should look for before the destruction occurs. And then he's going to talk about specific, there's going to be some specific and general signs. And give me 1 second. I don't know how to spell over here. 1 second. Okay. Okay, so more information is given. So let's read it. The Matthew account says, "And what that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will deceive many, and because lawlessness is multiplied, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be proclaimed in the whole world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." Okay? In Luke's account, it says, "Well, you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, and you will be hated by all because of my name. Yet not a hair of your head will perish. By your perseverance, you will gain your lives," or in the translation says souls. In Luke's account, "And brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and a children will rise up against parents and have them put to death, and you will be hated by all because of my name, but the one who endures to the end will be saved." So what do we see here? Again, these are complementary. These are complementary to each other. Okay, they're not contradictory, even though this says different information. You have to take it into account. Remember, the audience is different, the author is different, the purpose was a little bit different. In Matthew, talks about that many people will be falling away. This is in Matthew's account. We're going to see this is it speaks of in general sense that many people are going to fall away. There's going to be betrayal and hatred. We see false prophets will be arising, deceiving people. Sin will increase, and people's hearts will grow colder. But then it says that those who endure and remain faithful to God will be saved. And then when it says when the gospel must be preached to the whole world, again, like I said earlier, the audience is the first century. He's talking to his disciples. So the known world is the Roman world to them. Then the time of the destruction of the temple will come. In Luke's account, same thing we see now, that the betrayal is going to be to the disciples. That betrayal might come from even amongst their family members. And many disciples will be put to death, which we know that, I mean, they all eventually died, but a lot of them died in horrific ways. People will hate them, meaning the disciples, because of their faith, but the disciples will persevere to the end. So in Matthew's account, it was a more general sense, I guess, meaning it could have been to all believers, not just the disciples. But in Luke's account, he was specifically talking about the disciples. And what do we see in Mark? The betrayal, there's going to be betrayal even from amongst family members. Again, now he's speaking in a more general sense that these family members are going to be putting each other to death. So the sin is going to be increased so much that that's how bad things are going to get at that time. Believers will be hated, but those who endure to the end will be saved, again, in a general sense. Okay, so here's the good part right here. So this section is going to be talking about the abomination of desolation. But we're going to see that only 2 of the 3 gospel accounts actually use that phrase, abomination of desolation. But the gospel that doesn't use it uses a different phrase, which I think will help us understand what exactly that means. So let's go ahead and read it. This is the longest portion of the section here. So it says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through Daniel," we're going to get to it, the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out of that are in the house, and whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his garment. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in the days. But pray that your flight will not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. And unless those days were cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. The false Christ or prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to deceive, if possible, even to the elect. Behold, I have told you this in advance. So, I mean, just reading off of that, I don't know how the dispensationalists will take that and make it to way in the future. It makes no sense. It's obvious who he's talking to. Just the language he uses, it's applicable, more applicable for the first century, not the 21st century. Okay, in Luke's account, it says, so check this out. This is in Luke, the phrase "the abomination of desolation" is not used, but check out what it is used. Remember, I am arguing for the position that the Great Tribulation, the abomination of desolation, and all that happened in 70 AD when Rome came to destroy the temple. This is not something in the future for us. This was something in the future for them. Remember back in the end of chapter 23 in Matthew, where Jesus was giving them a condemnation and judgment. It said that this generation, meaning their generation, was going to see all of this. Okay. But when you see, so remember the other accounts say the abomination of desolation, but Luke says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that this desolation is at hand. Just this verse right there should prove my point. This is when Rome surrounded Jerusalem and attacked it, destroyed it, and killed and just slaughtered so many Jews. This happened in 70 AD. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the countryside must not enter the city, because these are the days of vengeance. What was the purpose of 70 AD of the destruction of the temple? This was a time of vengeance. Israel was going to pay for everything they did, back from the Old Testament days to the time that they killed Jesus. This was God punishing them. This was God divorcing them. This was God ending the Jewish system. The Judaic Aeon was done in 70 AD. So that all these things which were written will be fulfilled. The Old Testament spoke about this day when God would punish Israel, all the crap that they did. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies those days, for there will be great distress upon the land, okay, and wrath against this people. What land? Jerusalem. What people? The Jews. When did this happen? 70 AD. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled. Who are these Gentiles that came and killed them by the sword? Who are these Gentiles that came and trampled over them? The Roman army in 70 AD. Mark's account says, but when you see the abomination of desolation, quoted from Daniel, standing where it should not be. So when you see this abomination of desolation, think the army surrounding Jerusalem. Those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and and the one who is on the housetop must not go down or go into to get anything out of his house, and the one who is in the field must not turn back to get his garment. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, but pray that it may not happen in the winter, for those days will be a time of tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of creation, which God created until now and never will be. And unless the Lord has shortened those days, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened those days. So what's going on here? In Matthew's account, he's quoting Daniel 9:27, Daniel 11:31, and Daniel 12:11, which I'm going to read to you right now. Daniel 9:27. And later on, I'm going to exegete the whole Daniel passage. And it says, and he has strengthened a covenant with many, one period of 7. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. Let me switch up. And he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he will make sacrifice and grain offering cease. And on the wing of the abominations will come one who makes desolate, even unto the complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Folks, this is talking about the Jews getting destroyed by the Roman army. And again, a little bit later, I'm going to exegete the whole thing. The other one was Daniel. Well, mind you, these were all quoted in the Olivet discourse. The next one is Daniel 11:31, which says, okay, tell me this does not fit perfectly the surrounding armies around Jerusalem. Daniel 11:31 says, mighty forces from him will stand, profane the sanctuary fortress, and abolish the regular sacrifice, and they will set up abominations of desolations. And the last one is Daniel 12:11. But from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1290 days. And we'll touch upon that in a bit. Okay? So we see here Jesus is quoting from Daniel. This abomination will be standing by the holy place, which is Jerusalem. Those in Judea must flee the mountains. People must not go back to get anything. They must leave immediately. This is the great tribulation. Not anything in the future, not no 7-year tribulation and none of that baloney that the dispensationalist guys believe. It talks about false messiahs and false prophets will arise in these times, trying to deceive people. And Jesus in Matthew says, hey, I warned you guys in advance this was going to happen. Now, in Luke's account, again, it doesn't say abomination of desolation, it's the army surrounding Jerusalem. Here, the abomination phrase is not used, but it's army surrounding Jerusalem. The army that will come and destroy the temple, that army is Rome in AD 70. People in Judea must flee to the mountains, and it says that those near the city, Jerusalem, the countryside of Jerusalem, must leave. They must not enter the city during this time because they didn't get killed. This is a day of vengeance, as it was to fulfill the scriptures. So let me actually read the whole Daniel passage, and I will exegete it for you. So Daniel 9:24-27 says, 70 weeks have been determined for your people, Israel, and for your holy city, Jerusalem, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the Holy of Holies. So you are to know and have insight that from from the going out of a word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah, the Prince, there will be 70 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be restored and rebuilt with plaza and meat, even in times of distress. Then after 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And it will and its end will come with a flood, even to the end. There will be war, desolations are decreed, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will make sacrifice and grain offering cease, and on the wing of abominations will come the one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. And I am arguing that this right there is prophesying the destruction of the temple. So let me break it down. Verse 24, we see that the angel Gabriel tells Daniel that 70 weeks was determined for Israel and its city. In 70 weeks, there would be an atonement for all their sins. So atonement in this context is not necessarily forgiveness of sin, but the sin must be atoned for, or in the case of Jerusalem, the punishment that will come upon them for everything. Because remember, Jesus in Matthew 23 said that a judgment was coming upon them for everything that had happened, right? And which would eventually be the destruction of the temple 70 AD. We have to understand that weeks is equivalent to 7 years. So 70 weeks would be 490 years until the anointing of the Holy of Holies, which is a reference to Jesus, who would make an end to sin, bring everlasting righteousness. Who ends sin? Who brings everlasting righteousness? Jesus only. In verse 25, in the context of Daniel, King Cyrus would issue a decree that allowed the Jews to go back home and rebuild the temple. From that time until the arrival of Jesus, the angel said that it would be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which is 69 weeks total. Verse 26, it speaks where it says he will be cut off. That speaks of Jesus' death. Then the people of the prince will come and destroy Jerusalem and its temple, and we know that that is talking about the Roman army. In verse 27, the firm covenant that it speaks of is the new covenant in Christ. Christ fulfills all of the Old Testament law. Christ ends the sacrificial system and fulfills the entire law of Moses. The abomination that makes desolation is when Rome comes, the army surround Jerusalem, and they are wiped out, completing the 70 weeks prophecy, which happened in 70 AD. So we see this is a time of great distress upon the land and great wrath that is coming upon Israel. These people will fall by the edge of the sword, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles, which is Rome. In Mark's account, it again talks about the abomination of desolation standing where it's not supposed to be at, which is the Roman army getting ready to surround Jerusalem. Those in Judea must flee the mountain, those must move back and get their things. This is a time of tribulation. Okay, now we get to the more difficult passage. These right now moving forward are the hardest ones. So this section is going to be talking about the coming of the Son of Man. This is where people get confused as they think the second coming of Christ. But I don't think that's what he's talking about. I think it's more of, we're going to see that some of the language, apocalyptic language, there's a lot of imagery, there's a lot of metaphors, a lot of hyperbole. It means something else. It's not necessarily the second coming of Jesus. It's more of the Jesus coming, not physically per se, but coming in a sense where he's going to fulfill everything that he predicted, which is the punishment on Jerusalem. So Let's go ahead and read it, and we'll break it down even more. In Matthew's account, it says, "Therefore, if they say to you, Behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out, or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east, appears even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." Okay, so what do we see in Mark's? We see that it warns again that there's going to be, do not fall, because there's going to be false messiahs. The coming of the Son of Man will be known and seen by everyone in the first century context. The interesting part, notice that last verse right here, verse 28, where it says, "Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." Corpse is a symbol of the Jews that would be slaughtered, and vultures, also can be translated as eagles, is a metaphor, a symbol that Roman soldiers would use on their flags and on their shields. Right? And then it says immediately after the tribulation, it's going to start talking about, did I go too far? Oh, sorry. I didn't even finish it. Sorry. Yeah, so wherever the vultures comes, where the corpses and the vultures together. Sorry, I didn't finish the whole thing. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall in the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and the signs of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky, which is quoted from Daniel again, with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the one end of the sky to another. Okay, so let me break it down. So, like I said, it's talking about the coming of the Son of Man, not the second coming of Christ. Everyone's going to see it. The corpse represents the Jews. The vultures or eagles is a metaphor which were symbols that were used on a Roman flag and shield. Then it talks about the sun, moon, and stars and all that, right? Those are metaphors that these Old Testament images that were used is used by Jesus, and is not to be taken literal. It's hyperbole. It is judgment language. And let me give you an example. In Isaiah 13:9-11, it says, "Behold, the day of Yahweh is coming, cruel and fury and burning, to make the land a desolation, and he will exterminate its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark, and it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. Thus I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will also put an end to pride of arrogant, and bring low the lofty pride of the ruthless." And there's many other passages in Isaiah, Ezekiel, Joel, Amos, Zephaniah, where we see the sun, moon, stars pattern, which are all images of judgment language. However, there's another possible interpretation of what the sun, moon, and star and sky may refer. They could be Jewish idioms for governing authorities. And we see that in Genesis 37:9, where Joseph has a dream, and he dreams yet another dream and recounts it to his brother and says, "Behold, I have dreamed a dream again, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars are bowing themselves to me." Okay, in Revelation 12:1, "And a great sign was seen in the sky, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head were a garland of 12 stars." So again, in context, when those things are being said, it often talks about judgment language, but there are a few cases where, as the passage I just read, it could be talking about somebody or a governing authority, or someone with authority. Where it says the powers of heavens shaken is a metaphor. What that means, it is the established authorities were being dethroned and new authorities are now put into positions. Where it said that the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Remember, this is apocalyptic language. We cannot read these things literally. Must not be taken literal. This means when all these things are happening, the disciples will know that this is what Jesus had warned them would happen. That Jesus was now in heaven, in his throne, being the King of Kings, and he is fulfilling everything that he said would happen. And then the section where it says that all the tribes will mourn refers to the Jews mourning to the temple, that the temple are destroyed. Can you imagine? You're a Jew, all right? There's chaos. Rome just came, slaughtered everybody. People are leaving, right? And then you find out, oh my God, our temple has been destroyed. They desecrated our Holy of Holies. And so all the Jews, all the tribes, if you're a Jew, are you not going to mourn over that? So that's what that passage is talking about. And then where it says that the Son of Man is coming on the cloud, again, I understand, trust me, because when I first started studying this, I was like, oh, is this the second coming? No, because he is quoting out of Daniel. This is why when we see the New Testament writers quote from the Old Testament, you have to go back and read it, because it may give you an understanding of what's going on. So the Son of Man coming on the clouds is not the second coming of Christ. If we look at the passage in Daniel 7:13, and I'm going to read it for you right now, which says, Daniel 7:13, and it says, I kept looking in the night vision, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like the Son of Man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days and came near before him. So in this section, the coming of the Son coming on the clouds, in Daniel, Jesus is going up. He is ascending to the Ancient of Days, to the Father. This passage, that statement of the Son of Man coming on the cloud, is referring to Daniel when Jesus is going to heaven and the kingdom is being delivered. He is on his throne now. But we read this, which I understand. We read this as, oh, Jesus is coming down on the clouds. No, in Daniel, Jesus is going up, which is why this cannot be the second coming of Christ. This is Jesus being enthroned as the king. Now, this is ascension. Now, clouds in the Old Testament have a few usages of it. So in the Old Testament, anytime some sort of a cloud was mentioned, it usually referred to the presence of God, or it referred to judgment. And I will read one passage in Ezekiel. You guys can check it out, Ezekiel 30, verses 3-4, Joel chapter 2, 1-2, and Isaiah 19:1. I'm going to read Ezekiel 30, 3-4. Just so you can kind of see Ezekiel 30. Okay, 30. For the day is near, even the day of Yahweh is near, and it will be a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations. A sword will come upon Egypt, and anguish will be in Ethiopia. When the slain fall in Egypt, they take away her multitude, and her foundation are pulled down. So again, when you see clouds in the Old Testament, obviously, anytime we see any type of word, we have to look at it in its context, but it's going to be used as either the presence of God or some sort of judgment that God is doing either on Israel or on Egypt or any other nation. Now, the next two, I will be honest, I could be wrong. However, it makes sense. But again, I could be wrong, but I lean towards this position. When it says that he will send his angels to gather the elect, in the Greek, the word angel can also be messengers. Remember, a lot of times the Greek word in English can have multiple meanings to it. And we've already established that what we're talking about here is something that is occurring in the first century. The audience being the disciples and the Jewish people who were about to get punished for what they did. So, with keeping that in mind, what does it mean when it says that he is sending his angels to gather his elect? Are we to take this as physical angels are going to come in the first century to gather all his people? I say not. That doesn't seem plausible, because what would be the purpose of that? If we take the other definition of it as angels meaning messengers, it is a plausible interpretation that these messengers are the people who God gave the Great Commission to. And in context, it could be his disciples. Who did Jesus tell to go do the Great Commission? In context, he was talking to his disciples. And then eventually it kind of trickled off to us, the church. But again, we are in the first century right now. We cannot go beyond the text. We cannot make this about 21st century America. We are in the first century in a Jewish setting. Who are God's messengers at this time? They are the disciples. So that's kind of where I'm going to lean to that. Again, I could be wrong, but it just makes sense if we keep it in its first century context. And the part where it says about blowing of the trumpet, in that time, in that era, blowing of the trumpet meant like a royal decree was about to be announced. You know, like you blow the trumpet, the king comes, and here's a decree that this and this and this is going to happen. I think we've even seen that in movies or cartoons. So that makes more sense. But the angel ones, I'll be honest, it's a little tough one. It is a tough one, but that's kind of where I'm gonna lean to. Now, in Luke's account of this section, the same thing. We're gonna see the sun, the moon, star metaphors, earth, and nations. Can also, and it's another thing. So the Greek word for earth and nations can also be translated as land, right? So what I think it fits better to translate it as land, because the land that is about to get destroyed is Jerusalem. And then Luke talks about that there's going to be great fear and that the powers of heavens are shaken, which we already talked about that. And they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds, which is a first century audience that the disciples and the people that killed him are, because Jesus warned them that they would see this, that they would know this, that when they saw all of this happening, they were going to remember Jesus' words, and that Son of Man coming in clouds is, that's Daniel. What was Daniel talking about there? The ascension to Christ, to his throne in heaven. Mark's account, again, gives warnings about fake messiahs, fake prophets. Jesus reminds the disciples that he had told them about everything that was coming. Again, we see the usage of the sun, moon, and stars metaphor, the heaven shaken metaphor, and the coming of the Son of Man, which we already talked about. And then again, the whole sending the messengers to gather his elect. I'm going to lean to the position that it could be the disciples fulfilling the Great Commission. These parts right here are difficult. I'm going to be honest. These are very difficult parts here. So, which is why from the beginning I said there's certain parts I'm not 100% sure, and I could be wrong, but I think that the way I'm presenting it right now, if we keep it in context, it makes a lot more sense. So the next section, which is a very easy one, is the parable of the fig tree, right? And Matthew, Luke, and Mark, it's the same account. What does that parable mean? It's an analogy where it says, when you see the leaves on the fig tree come out, then you know it's summer. Jesus is saying, when you see all these signs that I just told you about, know that the time of judgment is coming, and that is the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. The next section, which is this is a slam dunk to when this could have happened. Remember back in Matthew 23, before we even started the Olivet discourse, Jesus told the Pharisees that this generation was going to endure all these things, right? So this generation means the first century, the generation that killed Jesus, the time of the apostles. And it says that Jesus's words would not pass away, and everything that he predicted will happen in a generation. What is a biblical generation? It's about 40 years. So if Jesus died in the early 30 ADs and the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, that's about a generation of 40 years. So this section here already rebukes anyone who says that the Olivet discourse is something in the 21st century, the 22nd century, our future, because Jesus specifically said that this generation, meaning the first century, those people that he was talking to, it was not passed until everything that he just talked about occurred. So there is no way exegetically that everything that Jesus has said up to this point is in the future for us. The Great Tribulation, all of this has already happened in 70 AD. Then the final two sections, which again, these are a little rough as well. Jesus talks about, because they had asked him, the disciples asked him, well, when is this going to happen? Right? So the disciples wanted a specific day. This is what Jesus said in Matthew 36 to 41. It says, but of that day, speaking of the day that from verses 1 to 36, it's all the same thing. And Jesus says here, okay, you want to know about when all this is going to happen. Okay. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven or the Son, but the Father alone. For just as the days of Noah were, so the coming of the Son of Man will be. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving into marriage until the day of Noah and to the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be two in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding grain at the mill, one will be taken, one will be left. So it's funny how the dispensationals will take that and try to use that as the rapture. But if you actually read it exegetically, it has nothing to do with the rapture. And if you actually follow the whole chapter from 23 to now, it has nothing to do with that, because it's talking about the Jews. It has nothing to do with the rapture. So what do we see in this section? The disciples want a specific day, but Jesus says to them that only the Father knows. No one knows. He uses an analogy of Noah's days, meaning that, okay, as when we read these things, and I get it, because we all have this thing that we want to read the scriptures like if they're 21st century. No, we have to put ourselves, as you read, especially this section, when you read these, put yourself as one of the disciples, and you're asking these questions. And I think that'll help you understand it if you put yourself in the context, in the audience of who Jesus is talking to, which is not 21st century America. He's talking to the first century Jews. They want to know, when is this going to happen? And he says, no one knows. Only the Father knows. The analogy of Noah was basically saying that, you know what? Everyone's going to be living normally. They're going to get married. They're going to be drinking. They're going to be doing all kinds of stuff. And then boom, it comes. And everybody takes this Olivet discourse as the end, the second coming of Christ. But if you've been following what I exegetically, verse by verse, we've been talking about, it is impossible that this is the second coming of Christ. It is more plausible exegetically that this is the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So it's going to come unexpectedly, and then he gives another parable. And Luke's account of the same thing, it talks about telling the disciples to be on guard. If this was for the future, if this was 21st century us, why in the world is he telling the disciples to be on guard? It makes no sense to tell someone who's not even going to be present during the time of tribulation, hey, be ready. Watch out, there's going to be false messiahs, false prophets. Be on guard, don't be deceived. All those things are being told to the disciples. So how do you read that and then say it's 21st century America or the church in the 20? That makes no sense. You have to read it in context. That is why my videos sometimes are very long, because I want to walk through the scripture so you can understand the context. There is no way this is the future. This already happened. He's telling them, pray earnestly. He says that they may have strength to escape all the things that he spoke about that will come in their lifetime. Luke is telling the disciples, pray, stay on guard, be alert, that you can escape the massacre that was about to come on the Jewish people. In Mark's account, yeah, nobody knows. At the end of the hour, the Father sets it. He tells them to stay alert because they don't know when it's going to happen. Okay, and the final section is Jesus tells his disciples to be ready for that day. Matthew's account, again, he tells the disciples, stay awake. He didn't say, hey, 21st century United States, be awake. No, he's telling the disciples, stay awake and be ready, because you don't know when the Roman army is about to surround Jerusalem and destroy it all. And you don't want to be caught in the middle, then you get killed. And then we see that he uses like mini parables to teach them about being ready. And then in Mark's account, same thing. He says, stay ready, but the audience is his disciples. So I hope that I've shown it that the Olivet discourse, we went from chapter 23 all the way down. We cross-referenced with the Gospels, other Gospels account, Luke and Mark, and we see that all of this, it is impossible that this is a future event. This already happened. The audience was the disciples. The judgment and everything was for the Jews of the first century, because they would all eat their words. They would all remember, hey, he told us that this was going to happen. And they're going to be like, wow, it was true what he said. Jesus has ascended. Jesus is on the throne. He is fulfilling everything that he said. And I get it. There's certain passages here, like even myself, I was just like, wow, that makes no sense. That's a head scratcher. And I get it. But we've been taught, we bring in our presuppositions. These teachers, especially these dispensational teachers, have taught us that this is all future stuff. So you bring that into the text. But it's out of context. And again, there's no way this is the future. This already occurred. But yeah, so that's the Olivet discourse. I would encourage people to go back, read the chapters before it so you can get the context. I only gave you a summary, but I think it will help if you actually go back to read everything. For the sake of time, that's why I didn't do it. And remember that Mark, Luke, and Matthew, the audience was different. That's why some of the things that they say are a little bit different. They don't contradict themselves. They complement themselves beautifully. So yeah. Thank you guys for joining. If there's any other questions, or if you guys want my notes, please let me know. I have 9 pages full of notes. There's a lot of cross references, a lot of Old Testament passages that I didn't get a chance to read because we would have been here forever. All right. Thank you guys. Have a good night. God bless.